The heat lay upon the Thornley lands like a fever that would never break. It thickened the air, slow and soured, making the sugarcane bow under its own weight. The swamps nearby murmured, bloated with life that reeked of decay. Flies gathered at every corner of the mansion, drawn by the scent of molasses and sweat that drifted from the boiling sheds. Even the wind refused to pass freely through the cane fields, it crawled instead, sluggish and resentful, whispering through the stalks as though gossiping with the dead. The Thornley plantation had stood for 40 years, though locals said it was older than its timber. They said it was built upon another house, one that had burned long before any white man claimed the soil. When storms swept through and lightning scarred the trees, people swore they saw faces in the windows, faces not of flesh but of smoke, shaped from what the land refused to forget. Silas Thornley stood at the veranda railing, the boards beneath his boots gray and brittle from sun and time. His posture was that of a man who believed the world still bowed before him, though his shoulders had begun to stoop and his left hand trembled when he raised his glass. In that glass swirled bourbon the color of dried blood, and in its reflection, Silas thought he saw the shimmer of flames flickering over the fields. He blinked, and the illusion was gone, only the late sun glinting on wet cane. Behind him, Margaret Thornley adjusted the curtains to block the glare. Her fingers jingled with silver bracelets, thin, elegant things that once encircled other wrists. She never wore them when guests came, she said they clashed with civility. But in private she wore them always, as though they were penance or protection. The bracelets left faint green ghosts on her skin, like the memory of chains. "Storm's coming," she murmured. Silas didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the far edge of the property where the cane met the tree-line. He saw movement there, small, rhythmic, deliberate. The enslaved were harvesting under Elias Cain's watch, their backs slick with sweat, their voices humming in a low, continuous cadence. He could not hear the words, but he could feel the rhythm pulsing faintly through the air, like the drum of something old and unbroken. It unsettled him, though he'd never admit why. That song had been forbidden once. Margaret remembered the day Silas outlawed it, 10 years back, when an overseer found strange carvings on the stable doors and a white rooster buried headless at the steps. Silas declared it heathen noise, and ordered the instruments burned. But songs, like smoke, found their way through cracks. Now, as dusk began to smother the plantation in red light, the hymn rose again, soft, almost tender at first, then swelling into something that trembled in the bones. It carried across the fields, up the hill, into the hollow corridors of Thornley Mansion. Margaret felt it before she heard it, a quiver in her spine, the air heavy with what she could only call warning. If you're drawn in already, subscribe now, this story only gets darker from here. The house itself seemed to listen. The floorboards creaked as though remembering weight. The chandeliers swayed faintly though no wind entered the room. A single candle by the parlor mirror sputtered and went out, leaving behind the faint smell of sulfur. Margaret touched Silas's arm. "They're singing again." He gave a dismissive grunt. "Let them. Keeps them from gossiping. It doesn't sound like a hymn of comfort. Then it's a hymn of work." But Margaret heard something beneath it, an echo, a call and response that didn't match the rhythm of any psalm she knew. Her mother had once told her that songs of sorrow could turn into prayers for fire if sung often enough. From the quarters, Ruth Anne paused her labor to listen too. She was tall and lean, her skin burnished dark by sun and river light. Her hands were scarred from boiling cane, but her grip on the hoe was steady. She closed her eyes and pressed her bare feet deeper into the soil. The earth beneath her was damp, warm, and alive. She could feel it breathing, a slow exhalation of heat that rose between her toes. It was not my imagination. The land of Thornley always breathed that way, like something dreaming under the dirt. Samuel Holt, the carpenter, leaned his back against a fence post and whispered to her, "Hear it again, do you?" The low rumble. "It's not thunder," Ruth Anne said quietly. "It's waiting." Waiting for what? For someone to listen. Far off, Elias Cain cracked his whip, the sound slicing the evening like lightning without a storm. The singing did not stop. It shifted instead, lower, heavier. The tempo changed as if acknowledging the lash, then swallowed it whole. Even Elias, cruel as he was, hesitated. He spat into the dust, muttering something about witchcraft, then turned away. Inside the mansion, Silas Thornley poured another drink. The first sip burned, the second soothed. He did not notice the small spider crawling from the lip of his glass across his wrist. He did not notice Margaret's eyes following it, or how she flinched when it disappeared into his sleeve. The sun bled down behind the trees, and the swamp began to glow faintly with fireflies. They flickered in patterns that mirrored the rhythm of the hymn. Margaret told herself it was coincidence, that light and sound could not conspire. But when she turned to leave the veranda, she caught her reflection in the window and thought she saw a figure standing behind her, a woman with her hair wrapped in cloth, eyes like coals. She blinked, and the reflection was only her own pale face. Silas called for supper. The housekeeper, a frail woman named Dinah, moved silently through the parlor with her head lowered. She had served 3 generations of Thornleys and outlived 2, yet she was treated as part of the furniture. Tonight her hands shook as she set the table. When Margaret asked what troubled her, Dinah whispered, "The ground has been whisperin', ma'am. All day long. Like it does when something's comin', . Silas laughed. "The only thing coming is rain." But no rain came. That night, as the family ate in the dining room, the walls groaned like something alive. From the east window, a faint red shimmer flickered, distant fire from the boiling house. A worker must have stoked it too high, Silas thought. He made a note to punish someone in the morning. Yet even as he lifted his fork, the singing returned, closer now, threading through the cracks of the mansion, through floorboards and keyholes, curling beneath the clatter of silverware. Margaret stopped eating. "Silas." He set his utensils down with a clink. "You hear ghosts in everything. I hear the truth in things you refuse to name." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. He glared, then leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "These people owe everything to this land. To me. And still they sulk like cursed children. I give them food, roof, life itself. You give them chains." The words hung in the air between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cicadas outside screamed loud enough to fill the silence. Silas rose, his shadow stretching across the table like a black root. "Be careful, Margaret. You sound as foolish as that preacher who ran off last winter muttering about wrath." But even as he said it, a strange unease stirred in his chest. The bourbon no longer tasted right. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The chandelier above seemed lower than before. He wiped sweat from his temple, though the fire in the hearth had burned low. Later, in their chamber, Margaret could not sleep. She sat by the window, looking down at the quarters where faint lamplight still glowed. A line of figures moved slowly through the dark, Ruth Anne among them, carrying buckets toward the well. Their motion was silent, measured, too synchronized to be routine. Margaret wanted to believe they were simply fetching water, but something in the stillness made her heart pound. Then she saw it, the faintest gleam of red reflecting off the buckets, not from the moon, but from beneath the earth itself. She turned away and crossed herself. In the fields, Ruth Anne poured the well water over the ground, not to quench it, but to wake it. The soil hissed softly, steam curling upward. Samuel Holt joined her, whispering words from memory, fragments of an old prayer older than the plantation itself. When he finished, the wind shifted. It carried the hymn again, gentler now, like a promise whispered to flame. Back in the mansion, Margaret thought she heard footsteps in the hall though no one was awake. She pressed her ear to the door and caught a faint sound, like wood splintering slowly, or like breathing. The Thornley mansion had always been grand, white columns, sweeping staircases, rooms filled with imported furniture. But tonight it felt fragile, hollowed by time. The walls exhaled dust. The portraits seemed to watch. One painting, the first Thornley patriarch, grim-faced and self-satisfied, appeared darker than usual, the edges burned with a stain that hadn't been there before. Margaret covered it with a cloth. Outside, a storm gathered but refused to break. Lightning flashed silently within the clouds, illuminating the treetops for seconds at a time. The wind began to move again, whispering through the cane fields with voices almost human. Ruth Anne raised her head and whispered back, "Soon." Silas Thornley slept uneasily, dreaming of fire. He saw the mansion in ashes, the fields turned to embers, and a woman standing amid the ruin, barefoot, unburned, her bracelets melting down her wrists. When he woke, the scent of smoke lingered in the room though nothing burned. He rose and went to the window. In the darkness, the fields looked black and endless. Yet somewhere, faintly, he thought he saw a red pulse, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the land. He muttered to himself, must be lantern light. But the light did not move. It pulsed once more, then vanished. Down below, Ruth Anne closed her eyes and pressed her palm to the soil. The earth trembled softly beneath her touch, as though stirring from a long sleep. The hymn faded into silence, leaving only the hiss of the wind and the distant cry of a whippoorwill. And then, for the briefest moment, even the insects stopped. The night held its breath. The land remembered fire. By morning, the air had curdled into something heavy and strange. It wasn't just the heat, it was the silence underneath it, a silence so thick it made every sound feel like trespass. The cane fields stood still, their stalks drooping, their green dulled to the color of fatigue. Even the river beyond the orchard seemed slower, reluctant to flow. The Thornley plantation breathed uneasily, as though it knew its own foundations were beginning to rot. Margaret Thornley woke before dawn. She had dreamt again of the fire, this time it spoke. She could not remember the words, only the feeling. The flame had a voice, and it knew her name. Her nightgown clung to her back with sweat. When she looked toward the window, she thought the panes were fogged by humidity, but when she drew near, she realized the glass itself had warped, thin hairline cracks branching like veins. Downstairs, the servants moved in ritual rhythm, wood scraping against the hearth, spoons striking kettles, water sloshing from the well. None spoke above a whisper. Ruth Anne stirred cornmeal in a bowl, her movements steady, her eyes distant. Dinah shuffled beside her, whispering a prayer to herself, but Ruth Anne's lips did not move. She was listening again. Beneath the scrape of the ladle, beneath the whir of cicadas outside, she could still hear it, the low hum in the soil, the quiet murmur that pulsed like a buried drum. Ruth, Dinah said softly, you stop that listening, here. Ain't good to keep your ear on the ground like that. You call something up you can't put down. Ruth Anne turned, eyes calm but far away. Maybe it's already up. The old woman crossed herself and spat into the ash bin. Don't talk like that. Not in this house. Not where the walls can hear. Because the walls did hear. They always had. The mansion was alive in ways no one named aloud. Wood swelled and sighed without wind, doors shut themselves softly in empty corridors, and sometimes, when the night stretched too long, the faint sound of weeping slipped through the cracks of the floorboards. Elias Kane, the overseer, strode across the yard with his whip coiled at his belt, eyes bloodshot from whiskey. His right cheek bore a deep scar, an old injury from a runaway he'd caught and corrected. He told people it was from a mule's kick, but everyone knew the truth. Every morning, he recited a prayer before his first strike, Lord, make my hand steady and my heart stone. It was the only scripture he kept. He found Samuel Holt repairing a broken wagon axle near the stables. Work faster, he barked. Master wants that lumber hauled before noon. Samuel didn't look up. It'll hold when it's ready. Elias squinted, uncertain if he'd heard defiance or simple fatigue. Are you testing my patience, Holt? Samuel met his eyes then, gray, clear, unblinking. Just testing the wood. Patience ain't mine to test. The overseer's jaw twitched. He raised his hand but let it fall. Something in Samuel's stillness unnerved him. The man wasn't afraid, not in the way he should be. Elias turned sharply and stalked off toward the boiling shed, muttering curses that sounded like prayers gone bad. From her upstairs window, Margaret watched the exchange. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized tension when she saw it. It moved like a ripple through the air, invisible yet impossible to ignore. She'd grown used to tension in this house, it was as constant as humidity. Still, lately it felt different. Sharper. Closer. As though the very act of speaking could set something off. She sat at her vanity and opened her Bible. Between its pages lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, a letter she had written but never sent. It began, if God forgives all, why does he stay silent here? She had written it after seeing Ruth Anne's child die of fever years ago. She had promised herself she would write more, that she would tell someone, anyone, what life on Thornley soil truly cost. But the letter had never left her hand. Instead, she had folded it carefully and hidden it among the Psalms, where faith and guilt could live side by side. She traced the ink now, her hands trembling. From the hallway, Silas's voice broke the stillness. "Margaret. Elias says the well water's gone cloudy again. Find out what these people did to it." She rose, closing the Bible softly. "Maybe it's the soil," she said. He laughed from down the stairs, a low, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "The soil doesn't spoil itself, woman. The help's been lazy with the buckets." Lazy. That was the word he always used when the land rebelled. When crops failed, when livestock died, when storms swept through, it was never the curse of God or the nature of weather, it was laziness. It was sin. It was anything that wasn't his doing. Silas Thornley had built his name on the illusion of control. He believed every acre answered to his will, every soul bent beneath his authority. But lately, he found cracks even in that conviction. He had dreams he could not name, dreams of ash drifting down like snow while voices whispered in languages he did not know. He woke from them choking on phantom smoke. That morning, he found a dead crow on the veranda. Its feathers were blacker than pitch, yet its eyes were gone, cleanly pecked out. Around its neck was a single thread of red cloth tied in a knot. Silas stared at it for a long time before calling Elias to dispose of the nonsense. But as he walked away, he felt the faintest pressure beneath his boots, the wooden planks of the porch seemed to pulse, as though something alive moved beneath. By midday, the air had turned sour. The sugar-boiling house filled with a smell like rot. Workers moved slower, heads down. Ruth Anne labored among them, her hands blistered but steady. When Elias shouted, she did not flinch. When the cane juice hissed and splattered on her skin, she didn't cry out. The pain was a reminder, flesh could burn and still serve purpose. Josiah Reed appeared at the doorway, once a preacher, now half a ghost. His clothes hung loose, his beard untrimmed, eyes sunken but fierce. He had long ago stopped preaching in public, forbidden after Silas caught him teaching scripture that spoke of liberation. Still, he wandered the quarters at night, whispering verses of deliverance under his breath like contraband. He stepped closer to Ruth Anne. "You hear it too, don't you?" She didn't stop stirring. "The hum?" He nodded. "Ain't the wind? Ain't the river? It's coming from underneath." "Been there long before us," she said. "Just louder now." Josiah's gaze drifted toward the mansion on the hill. "That's 'cause it's wakin'. Folks have been sayin' the ground's angry. That it remembers every lash, every cry, every bone buried without name. I reckon the Lord doesn't forget, but maybe the dirt doesn't either." She turned to him then, her voice low. "If the dirt remembers, maybe it's time we remember the living." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, he felt something holy again. Not peace. Not grace. But purpose. That evening, storm clouds gathered again, heavy and purple, refusing to rain. The horizon glowed orange from the setting sun, casting the fields in a strange, bruised light. Margaret sat at the piano, playing softly to drown out her thoughts. The notes trembled, unsure of themselves, until one key stuck, a high, shrill tone that wouldn't release. No matter how many times she struck it, it wailed on its own, long after her fingers withdrew. She stood, heart pounding, and closed the lid. The sound stopped instantly. From outside, the song began again, the hymn of the fields. But tonight it was slower, deeper, almost mournful. A funeral rhythm. Comment the word ashes below if you feel the weight of what's coming. Silas thundered into the room, red-faced. "Tell them to stop that noise. I won't have it in my house." "You can't stop a song," she said quietly. "I can stop the mouths that sing it." He stormed out, calling for Elias. The slam of the front door echoed down the hallway like gunfire. Margaret stood alone, staring at the framed portrait of her husband's father hanging above the mantel. For the first time, she saw something new in those painted eyes, fear. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, thick and heavy. But the rain was strange, it smelled of rust, not water. Ruth Anne tilted her face upward and let it streak down her cheeks. When she wiped it away, her fingers came back stained faintly red. "The earth's bleeding," Samuel murmured behind her. She looked toward the mansion, its white walls glowing faintly in the storm light. "No," she said. "It's remembering." And somewhere beneath the ground, deep, deeper than the roots of the cypress, the hum became a tremor. The night would not be quiet again. The fever came with the fog. It rolled over Thornley plantation like smoke that had lost its flame, low, thick, and glistening with something unseen. By sunrise, the fields looked drowned, the cane slick and dark as if weeping. The workers moved through it slowly, their coughs echoing against the still air. Ruth Anne wiped her brow and tasted salt that wasn't sweat. The river had turned brackish overnight, as though it had swallowed blood. No one spoke of sickness at first. They called it fatigue, exhaustion, heat. But by the third day, a boy named Micah fell face first into the dirt and didn't rise again. The overseer, Elias Kane, kicked at his limp body with the toe of his boot and declared him lazy in death as he had been in life. When they buried Micah at sundown, the ground hissed as the first shovel struck, steam curling from the soil, thick and pale, like the breath of something buried alive. Ruth Anne knelt beside the grave and whispered words she did not know she remembered. They weren't prayers, not the kind Josiah Reed preached. They were older, syllables from her grandmother's tongue, carried across the ocean long before these fields had names. Samuel Holt stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He didn't ask what the words meant. Some things were not meant to be translated, only answered. That night, a storm raged over the bayou, lightning clawing across the sky without thunder. The air itself seemed to hum. In the mansion, Margaret Thornley could not sleep. She walked barefoot down the hall, the wooden floor cold beneath her feet, the walls whispering with the sound of rain that never reached the ground. When she passed the nursery, long unused since her own child had died stillborn years ago, she heard laughter. Soft, distant, wrong. She froze. When she opened the door, the room was empty. Only the curtains moved, swaying without wind, as if stirred by something passing unseen. The cradle rocked once, slowly, and stopped. She closed the door and pressed her forehead against it. "Lord," she whispered, "don't let me lose my mind before you take it." Down by the quarters, the fever spread faster. Clara Bell, a child of 7, began to shiver though her skin burned to the touch. Ruth Anne tended to her through the night, wiping her with river water gone warm. Josiah Reed sat nearby, murmuring psalms between clenched teeth, but his eyes were full of fury. "Where's the doctor?" Ruth Anne asked. "Master says it's the Lord's will," Josiah answered bitterly. "Says sickness is a trial to purify the soul." Ruth Anne wrung out the cloth again. "Ain't the Lord that left her like this?" By morning, Clara Bell's breathing turned shallow. Margaret arrived with a jar of salve and guilt in her hands. "Silas doesn't know I'm here," she said softly. Ruth Anne said nothing, only nodded toward the child. The woman knelt and touched Clara's forehead, her bracelets clinking faintly, the sound like small, sad bells. "She's so hot," she murmured. Ruth Anne's voice was steady. "The land's got her now." A moment later, Clara Bell's chest fell still. The silence that followed was thicker than grief. It was a pause before something irreversible. Margaret closed the girl's eyes, her fingers trembling. "She's with God now," she whispered. Ruth Anne looked at her. "Which one?" Margaret lifted her gaze, startled by the question, but Ruth Anne was already standing, already walking toward the door. The air outside was burning with humidity, the sky dim even at noon. Smoke rose from the far field where Elias had ordered the cane burned to cleanse the soil. The smell carried all the way to the quarters, acrid, sweet, unbearable. When the lashings began, Margaret could hear them from her bedroom. Silas shouted something about discipline, about order. But it wasn't order, it was fear. Ruth Anne did not cry out once. The whip cracked, the air shuddered, but her silence struck harder than the blows. When it ended, she stood bleeding, unbroken, her eyes fixed on the mansion as though seeing through its walls. That night, she found Josiah Reed in the shed behind the chapel ruins. He was carving something into wood, lines, circles, symbols older than scripture. "You shouldn't be here," he said. She knelt beside him. "You said the Lord don't forget. Maybe he needs help remembering." He looked up at her, and for a moment, his weariness turned to flame. "You talkin' about judgment?" "I'm talkin' about the truth." Samuel Holt joined them before dawn, carrying a rusted chain. "Found this under the floorboards of the old storehouse," he said. "Still warm." Ruth Anne touched the iron links. They burned faintly, though no fire had touched them. "It's waking," she whispered. "Comment the word ashes below if you feel the weight of what's coming." Inside the mansion, Silas Thornley sat in his study surrounded by papers he could no longer read. The numbers blurred, the ledgers bled together. He poured bourbon, but the glass cracked in his hand before he could drink. He cursed, staring at the thin line of blood pooling in his palm. When he looked closer, he saw the cut had turned black around the edges, as if ash had seeped into his veins. He stumbled to the mirror, his reflection flickering in the candlelight. For a moment, he saw another face behind his own, not ghostly, not pale, but dark as coal and burning from within. Its eyes were calm, patient, waiting. He smashed the mirror with his fist and watched the shards fall like rain. Margaret found him hours later, half drunk and muttering. "It's the air," he said. "The air's gone bad." "The air hasn't changed," she whispered. He laughed, a sound sharp and broken. "Then it's me." From the window, they saw the sugar field smoldering. The fire Elias had ordered had spread beyond the trenches meant to contain it. The smoke rose thick and grey, swallowing the horizon. Margaret clutched Silas's arm. "It's heading toward the mill." He pulled away, face twisted. "Let it. Maybe the fire will do what God won't." By nightfall, the fever reached the mansion itself. Servants collapsed one by one, and still Silas refused to call a doctor. "It's punishment," he told Margaret. "For their sins. For their songs." But Margaret could not ignore what she heard in those songs, the strange, rhythmic cadence that pulsed beneath her dreams. It was no longer mourning. It was a movement. Purpose. Down in the quarters, Ruth Anne gathered the others. The children were silent, the men weary but listening. Josiah's voice filled the small space. "They say the Lord sent fire once before," he said. "But maybe this time, he sent us." Ruth Anne placed her hand over the earth, feeling its warmth. "The land's already chosen." Samuel nodded. "Then we follow where it leads." Outside, the wind shifted. The smoke from the fields bent back toward the mansion, carried by unseen breath. It slid through the windows, crept beneath doors, settled into the drapes and rugs like memory. The walls began to darken with soot though no flame touched them. Margaret stood alone in the parlor, watching a single candle gutter in its holder. She thought of Clara Belle's small body, of the bracelets on her wrists, of every whisper she had ignored for the comfort of civility. She whispered, "If you're listening, Lord, forgive me for waiting." The candle flame flared, and then went out. Outside, the singing rose again, louder, closer, alive. But this time, it wasn't sorrow that filled it. It was a promise. The Thornley mansion shuddered once, as though something beneath it had turned in its sleep. And in the fields, where the ashes of Cain still smoked, the first spark found breath. The night the Thornley mansion burned began with stillness so deep it pressed against the ribs. Not even the cicadas spoke. The moon hung swollen over the cane fields, pale and wide like an unblinking eye. From the swamp came a low hum, too rhythmic to be wind. The air was thick enough to drink. Every living thing on that land seemed to sense that the waiting was ending. Ruth Anne stood by the well, her hands trembling though her voice did not. She whispered to the water, not a prayer, but a command. The reflection stared back at her, wavered, then rippled outward as if answering. Behind her, Samuel Holt approached carrying a torch he had not yet lit. His face was calm, but the muscles in his jaw were tight enough to ache. "It has to be tonight," he said. She nodded. "Before the dawn forgets our names again." Josiah Reed joined them from the shadows, the old preacher's Bible pressed to his chest. He looked older than ever, the lines of his face etched by both faith and fury. "You certain this is what the Lord wants?" he asked. Ruth Anne's eyes met his. "Maybe it's what the Lord refused to do himself." He said no more. All across the fields, small shapes moved, quiet, deliberate, almost invisible in the dark. Women carried buckets that didn't slosh, men carried shovels and chains that made no sound. Children stood watch at the tree lean, faces smeared with ash to hide the whites of their eyes. Even the dogs that usually barked through the night were silent. Elias Cain sat drunk on the porch of the boiling house, a bottle in one hand, his whip dangling from the other. He mumbled curses into the humid dark. When he finally rose to relieve himself by the wall, he saw Ruth Anne's figure by the well, still, waiting. "What you doin' up, woman?" he slurred. "You think night's yours now?" She didn't answer. He stepped closer, unsteady, his boots sinking into mud. "Answer me when I—" The rest never came. Something heavy struck the back of his head, the iron link of a broken chain swung with quiet precision. He dropped to his knees, eyes wide with confusion, before collapsing into the dirt. Samuel stood over him, breathing hard. "Don't look away," Ruth Anne said softly. "Let him see the ground before it takes him." They buried him behind the boiling house, no prayer, no cross. The chain went with him. The first torch was lit just before midnight. The flame caught the dry cane as though the earth had been thirsting for it. Fire bloomed outward in lines that curved like veins, traveling through the fields with terrifying grace. It moved faster than any wind should allow, guided by something older than air. The enslaved didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They moved in silence, efficient, purposeful, solemn. At the mansion, Margaret Thornley woke to the smell of smoke. It was faint at first, like a candle extinguished too late. Then it thickened, acrid, undeniable. She shook Silas awake. "Fire," she whispered. He bolted upright, coughing. "Where?" "Everywhere." They ran to the window. The horizon glowed red, the fields alive with flame. Silas grabbed his coat, shouting orders to no one. The house staff had already fled. He stormed into the hall, calling for Elias, for Dinah, for God himself, but only the creaking of the floorboards answered him. Margaret followed, her silver bracelets clinking as she clutched her shawl. The smoke was spreading fast, seeping through the gaps in the walls, curling down the grand staircase like a living thing. Outside, Ruth Anne walked toward the mansion. The firelight painted her face in gold and shadow. Around her, the others carried lanterns and axes, moving in a slow, united rhythm, not rage, but revelation. The cane crackled behind them, throwing sparks into the air like stars being born and dying at once. Samuel stopped near the stables, cutting loose the horses. "They'll run to the river," he said. "They'll remember where the water is." "Good," Ruth Anne said. "Let the beasts be free before the men." Josiah Reed raised his Bible to the flames. "The Lord sent plagues to Pharaoh," he murmured. "But tonight he sent fire." "Then preach, preacher," Ruth Anne said quietly. "Preach while it burns." He did. His voice rose above the crackle, rough and trembling, "Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse, behold." The mansion doors burst open. Silas Thornley stumbled onto the porch, face streaked with soot, pistol in hand. "You," he shouted into the darkness. "I built this land. I fed you. You think you can take it from me?" Ruth Anne stepped forward until the firelight touched her face. "It was never yours." He raised the pistol, his hand shaking. "I'll burn you with it." Her voice was calm. "You already did." He fired once, the shot went wide, lost in the roar of the flames. His second attempt never came, the smoke filled his lungs, choking him. He dropped the weapon, fell to his knees, and coughed until he could not breathe. Margaret screamed his name from the doorway, but the ceiling behind her cracked, glowing red through the seams. Samuel pulled Ruth Anne back. "It's time." But she hesitated. Watching Margaret, the pale, trembling woman framed by fire, she saw not a mistress, not an enemy, but a soul collapsing under the weight of its own denial. Margaret met her gaze through the smoke. For a moment, neither moved. Then Margaret whispered something Ruth Anne could not hear, and disappeared into the blaze. The mansion groaned like a dying beast. The roof caved first, collapsing in a shower of sparks that swallowed the grand staircase. The portraits melted from the walls, the chandelier fell in silence, its glass turning to rain. The fire spread outward, consuming everything it touched, but not wildly. It moved as if guided, sparing the quarters, circling the graves, climbing instead toward the heart of the house where the old family Bible lay open on the parlor table. When the flames reached it, the pages did not burn immediately. They blackened slowly, one by one, as if read aloud by unseen hands. By dawn, only the stone foundation remained. The sky was crimson and gray. The air stank of iron and sugar and ash. Ruth Anne stood at the edge of the ruins, her hair streaked with soot, her skin shining with sweat and sorrow. Around her, the others gathered, hollow-eyed, quiet, alive. Samuel dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the scorched earth. "It's over," he said. Ruth Anne shook her head. "No. It's beginning." Josiah Reed, voice raw from smoke, looked up at the brightening horizon. "Then let it be the beginning of something worth the fire." They watched as the last embers dimmed. In the distance, the river carried the ash downstream, turning the water gray. The plantation was gone, but the land was breathing, slow, deep, as if finally exhaling centuries of withheld rage. Somewhere under the rubble, a faint sound persisted, not a crackle, not wind, but the rhythm of the same hymn that had begun it all. Only now, it was different. Not mournful. Not angry. Something between forgiveness and warning. If this story haunted you, subscribe, because the next fire has already begun somewhere else. And when the sun finally rose over the Thornley lands, the ashes shimmered like tiny mirrors, reflecting not ruin, but reckoning. Morning did not rise over Thornley. It crawled. A weak, gray light crept across the land as if reluctant to see what the night had done. Smoke still hung low over the cane fields, heavy and motionless, turning the air into something that felt alive, thick enough to choke on, yet sweet with the ghostly perfume of sugar and blood. The Thornley mansion was gone. Only the skeletal chimneys stood, jagged against the dull sky like fingers clawing upward from the earth. The roof had fallen in on itself, and beneath the ashes, pieces of glass caught the light like tears frozen mid-fall. The air hummed faintly, as though the fire had left behind a voice that refused to die. Ruth Anne stood before the ruins, barefoot, the hem of her dress blackened with soot. Her face was streaked with ash, but her eyes were clear, two small mirrors of what had survived. Around her, the others gathered silently. No one spoke of victory. There were no cheers, no relief. Only breathing, cautious, collective, as if testing whether the air was still safe to claim. The earth beneath their feet was warm, almost pulsing. The land itself seemed to remember everything, every scream, every strike of the whip, every prayer that had gone unanswered. Now it held the silence of answered prayers, prayers fulfilled not by mercy, but by flame. Josiah Reed sank to his knees in the soot, his Bible clutched to his chest. The pages had been singed at the edges, curling like petals touched by frost. "Fire don't lie," he said hoarsely. "It takes what's rotten first." Samuel Holt stood beside him, his hands raw and blistered. "And what's left?" The preacher looked at the ruins. "What's left is what truth can't burn." Beyond them, the fields smoldered in long, black veins that crisscrossed the plantation. The sugarcane was gone, reduced to char and smoke. The wind that blew over it carried the faint sound of humming, a single voice, low and steady. It came from Ruth Anne. Her lips barely moved, but the tune carried across the clearing like a ghost finding its way home. It wasn't a song of mourning anymore. It was a song of remembrance, soft, unwavering, dangerous in its calm. Samuel listened, eyes closed, and whispered, "The hymn of cinders." The name clung to the morning like dew. Not far from where they stood, the river glistened with ash. Its surface shimmered like oil, reflecting the remnants of the fire in long, trembling streaks. Margaret Thornley's body was found near the water's edge, half covered in reeds. Her bracelets had melted to her wrists, fused into her skin, but her face was peaceful, lips parted, eyes open, as though still searching for the child she never had. Ruth Anne knelt beside her. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she reached down and touched the woman's hand. It was cold but clean, no soot, no blood, no judgment. Only stillness. She stayed, Ruth Anne whispered. "Didn't run." Josiah crossed himself. "Maybe that's her repentance." Samuel shook his head. "Maybe that's her punishment." The preacher's voice softened. "Sometimes they do the same thing." They buried Margaret Thornley beneath a magnolia tree at the river bend. No cross, no name. Only the bracelets, melted and fused, marked the spot, a silent circle of silver and gilt. As they covered her with earth, Ruth Anne began to hum again, and one by one, the others joined her. Their voices rose not in harmony, but in memory, rough, uneven, human. The sound rolled across the blackened land like a tide returning. Hours passed. Smoke drifted upward, breaking into thin streams that wound through the trees. By noon, distant boats appeared on the river, neighboring planters and townsmen drawn by the fire's glow still visible from miles away. They brought rifles, water, and judgment. When they reached the shore and saw what remained, none spoke. The men covered their mouths with cloth, muttering prayers. One of them, a man named Colonel Whitfield, stepped forward and pointed toward Ruth Anne and the others standing among the ruins. "Who led this?" he demanded. Ruth Anne didn't answer. He raised his voice. "Who burned Thornley down?" Samuel stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "The land did." Laughter rose from the men, nervous, brittle. "The land?" Whitfield spat. "The land ain't got hands." Samuel met his gaze. "You sure?" The colonel faltered, eyes darting toward the smoking earth. The ground beneath him gave a faint hiss, the kind made when rain meets hidden coals. He stepped back, muttering a curse. Another man knelt to touch the soil. He yelped and pulled his hand away, shaking it. "It's still hot," he said. "It'll stay that way," Josiah murmured, "till the debt's paid in full." The men left by sundown, too frightened to linger. They called it vengeance, called it savagery. But when they returned to their plantations, they found their own workers staring at them differently, not defiant, not pleading, just silent. And silence, they learned, could be more dangerous than revolt. As darkness returned, Ruth Anne sat by the ashes of the mansion. Fireflies drifted in the air, their faint lights echoing the embers that still glowed beneath the ruin. She closed her eyes and listened. The fire's roar had faded, but beneath the crackling she heard something else, breathing. Slow, steady, endless. "The land's alive again," she whispered. Samuel lay nearby, staring at the stars. "Alive doesn't mean merciful." "No," she said. "But maybe it's honest now." Josiah turned a page in his scorched Bible. "You reckon they'll come back?" "They'll send men to rebuild," Samuel said. "They always do." Ruth Anne smiled faintly. "Then we'll see if the land lets them." The preacher looked toward the mansion's remains, the black stone and shattered glass gleaming faintly under the moon. "You think it'll haunt them?" "It already does." From the ruins came a faint, hollow sound, like wind passing through a flute, or voices trapped in wood. The melody was familiar. It was the hymn, reshaped, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. The living froze where they sat, recognizing it at once. The dead, perhaps, were singing. Samuel whispered, "They're still here." Ruth Anne didn't answer. She stood, letting the wind lift her hair. The glow of the embers painted her silhouette in gold and shadow. For a moment, she looked less like a woman and more like a vision, something caught between creation and consequence. Josiah bowed his head. "What'll you do now?" Ruth Anne looked to the horizon, where the smoke met the stars. "Keep walking. There's more fire waiting somewhere." The preacher nodded. "And the hymn?" She smiled faintly. "The hymn never ends. It just changed its name." The wind shifted, carrying the last notes of their song across the ruins, over the water, into the dark. By dawn, the Thornley lands were quiet again. The ashes cooled. The last wisp of smoke rose like incense from a burnt offering. And beneath the cypress trees, where the soil was black and soft, the roots began to hum, a low, eternal murmur that sounded almost like prayer. Years passed before the land dared to speak again. What was once Thornley Plantation became a hollow name, spoken only in whispers by those who remembered the fire or heard its echo carried down the river on fog-drenched nights. The mansion's stone bones remained, dark and glistening with mildew, surrounded by a wilderness that seemed to reclaim what was stolen from it. The cane never grew back there. No seed would take root in that blackened soil. And those who tried to till it said the earth felt warm, too warm, even in the heart of winter. The neighbors called it cursed. They told their children not to cross the boundary fence, not to walk near the magnolia tree where the woman with melted bracelets was buried. Yet the children came anyway, drawn by stories older than their parents. They said if you stood there at dusk and listened long enough, you could hear breathing, not the wind, not the river, but the earth itself, steady and slow, like the sleep of something that had only pretended to die. In the town of Pine Hollow, 10 miles upriver, the Thornley fire became half myth, half warning. The preachers called it judgment. The merchants called it misfortune. The freedmen who drifted through after the war called it justice. But no one agreed on who started it, or how it had spread so fast, or why it had never reached the slave quarters that night. Some said the wind changed by divine hand. Others swore the fire had chosen where to burn. Ruth Anne never returned to Pine Hollow. She and the survivors vanished into the swamps in the weeks after the fire. There were stories, though, fragments carried by travelers and traders. A woman matching her description was seen tending to the sick near Baton Rouge. Another said she led hymns by lantern light for freed souls who refused to leave their dead behind. Some whispered that she had gone deeper still, into the marshes, where no white man dared follow, and built a settlement of her own. They said it was a place of quiet, not peace, exactly, but understanding. Josiah Reed lived long enough to see freedom written on paper but never believed the ink would last. He walked from plantation to plantation, carrying his charred Bible and a cane carved with the symbols he once etched in secret. When people asked about Thornley, he only said, "The Lord wrote that story in fire. I was just the echo." He died in his sleep on a summer night, clutching his Bible to his chest, and when they buried him, the ground beneath his coffin trembled faintly as if acknowledging one of its own. Samuel Holt took work rebuilding homes in the ruins of war. He never spoke of Thornley again, though his hands refused to touch sugarcane wood for the rest of his life. The others called it superstition. He called it a memory. But the land remembered everything. As decades passed, vines crawled through the remains of the mansion. The hearthstone where Silas Thornley had once stood cracking his orders was now split in two. Rain pooled where the parlor once gleamed. In summer, the air above the ruins shimmered like heat though no sun touched it. In winter, mist clung to the ash like lace, and sometimes, only sometimes, it carried the faint scent of molasses and smoke. At night, travelers along the river claimed to see flickers of orange between the trees, like firelight dancing with no source. When they drew closer, there was nothing, only the steady whisper of the reeds and the occasional echo of distant singing, too soft to trace, too human to dismiss. One such traveler was a young preacher named Elijah Crane. He had come south chasing stories of miracles and curses, intent on finding proof that the devil himself had walked the earth. What he found instead was the Thornley ruin. He arrived just before dusk. The air was heavy with gnats and the slow hiss of the river dragging past the bank. He tethered his horse by a fallen fence post and stepped onto the black soil. It was still warm. Elijah removed his hat and whispered a prayer. "If evil lingers here, let it be known. If justice lingers here, let me see its face." The wind did not move, but the silence deepened. He walked through what had once been the grand entrance, now an arch of stone choked with vines. The scent of damp wood and rust filled his lungs. He could feel the faintest vibration beneath his boots, not sound, not tremor, but a pulse. He reached what must have been the center of the old parlor. A magnolia root had split the floor, forcing its way through what was left of the hearth. He knelt beside it and touched the cracked stone. The warmth beneath startled him. He whispered, "Lord, what lives here?" The answer came as a hum. Soft at first, like a sigh exhaled through hollow walls. Then stronger, rolling through the ground beneath him, surrounding him, resonating in his chest. It was not one voice. It was hundreds, layered and distant, singing in low unison. He could not make out the words, only the feeling, sorrow, defiance, grace. The preacher stumbled backward. The hum grew louder. The smoke that had slept in the ruins began to stir, rising in delicate spirals that formed vague shapes, outlines of people, faces half made from light and ash. They moved together, swaying gently, as if to a rhythm older than breath. Elijah dropped to his knees. "Mercy," he whispered. "Sweet mercy." The shapes faded, the air cooled, and the humming quieted until all that remained was the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the ruins. When he returned to Pine Hollow, pale and trembling, he told the townsfolk that Thornley was no place for men or devils, that it belonged to something greater, something the fire had freed, not destroyed. He left 2 days later and was never seen again. The stories spread, of course. They always do. By the turn of the century, Thornley had become folklore. schoolchildren dared each other to bring back ash from the site. Lovers carved initials into the magnolia trunk, believing the roots could keep their promises safe. Superstitious farmers left offerings, tobacco, cornmeal, flowers, at the fence line before planting season, whispering, "Let our harvest be spared." And every so often, when drought struck or sickness returned, people said they saw her, a tall woman in a faded dress, her feet bare, her face neither young nor old, standing at the river's edge. She would look toward the horizon, then vanish into mist. The next morning, rain would fall. They called her the Keeper of Cinders. Some said she was Ruth Anne. Others said she was the land itself made flesh. Either way, no one doubted she walked where Thornley once stood. In time, the place was forgotten by name but not by nature. Roads shifted, maps changed, but the soil remained marked. Nothing grew tall there, nothing built would stay standing. Travelers who camped too near claimed they heard crackling in the night, the soft, rhythmic hiss of unseen flame. One evening, long after even the memory of slavery had turned to history in schoolbooks, a group of surveyors came to chart the area for a new sugar refinery. They were modern men, educated, paid by companies that worshipped profit more than God. They laughed at the locals who warned them to stay away. By morning, their camp was gone. Their horses returned days later, eyes wild, saddles blackened with soot. The surveyors were never found. The company abandoned the project. The map remained blank over that patch of land. In the decades that followed, the world grew loud with machines and money and progress. Yet Thornley's silence endured. Hunters who crossed its border found their compasses spinning. Nightbirds fell quiet there. And sometimes, just as dawn broke, a faint glow would rise from the soil, a low orange shimmer that faded as soon as it was noticed. One old man who lived nearby said he could still hear the hymn on cold nights. "It ain't a song," he'd tell anyone who asked. "It's the ground breathin'. You listen close enough, you'll hear names in it, names that ain't been spoken in 100 years. He was right. Because the earth remembers. Always. And it does not forget the price of forgetting. On the 100th anniversary of the Thornley burning, a traveling preacher stopped in Pine Hollow. He carried a worn Bible bound with string and said he was tracing stories of redemption. When someone told him about the ruins upriver, he smiled, not with curiosity, but with recognition. That night, he walked alone toward the old grounds. The moon was hidden, the air heavy with rain. When he reached the fence line, he knelt and placed his hand on the soil. It was still warm. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Ruth Anne." The wind rose, carrying the faintest hum through the cypress branches, the hymn, unchanged. He smiled, laid his Bible on the ground, and walked forward until the mist swallowed him. The next morning, the townsfolk found the Bible at the edge of the ruins. Inside was a single verse burned into the page, though no fire had touched it. "The fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is." No one ever saw the preacher again. Now, when storms sweep through Louisiana, the lightning often strikes where Thornley once stood. The locals say it's the land clearing its throat, reminding the world it still breathes. When thunder follows, it echoes like the roll of distant drums, slow, certain, ancient. And when the rain falls hard enough to turn the soil to rivers of black, the water runs warm, carrying flecks of silver downstream, bracelets melted by justice, still glinting faintly beneath the surface. Even now, if you walk through the ruins at dusk, the air feels alive. The ground hums softly, like a body at rest but not asleep. And if you stand very still, between the magnolia and the chimneys, you'll hear a voice, low, patient, unending. It won't call your name. It will simply remind you that names don't matter when the land remembers everything. If this story haunted you, subscribe, because the next fire has already begun somewhere else. And beneath the cypress roots, the Thornley fire still breathes.